Hi.
How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. As you can see, there's a semblance of light coming in, and I look to every day as a sort of a harbinger for how should we feel, because we only have so many inputs these days. Is it sunny? Are less people dying? Things like that. So, like most people, I'm seeking a balance between doing what we do for a living and remembering the world we live in. Suddenly.
Yeah, well, let me just start by welcoming you to the show. I'm so glad that you said yes. I have this great opportunity to talk to people that I worked with in the past. And although you and I didn't work together professionally, it's just great to see everybody and reconnect with everyone. And of course, we're going to get into the days
Yeah.
because that was a magical time. Um, so, so thank you. I think the last time, Philippe, you and I talked was way back in 1998. I
Yeah.
I believe I was interviewing at your agency, and during that interview, and I was a young writer at that time, and I'd come to you and I'd said, Philippe, I really want to do really creative work, stuff that really breaks through. And in that interview, you gave me some advice that I have not forgotten. It was great advice. And you said creativity is great as long as it's within the confines of a great strategy. And here we are 22 years later. And of course, that advice has stood the test of time, as I soon learned throughout my career. So I want to thank you for that right away.
Oh, you're welcome. It was hardly a Talmudic inscription in the tablets coming down from the mountain, but and many people subscribe to it. So I'm glad that it served you well.
Yeah, and thanks for that. Of course, we'll get into the days because you did some great work while you were there. But yeah, we kind of started this interview by talking about this global pandemic and how everyone is doing. And it's funny, you said, what do you say? You talk about the weather. It's sunny. It's whatever. Uh, I feel like I was speaking to someone the other day, and it was like, it feels like there's a bit of fatigue going on with this whole thing. How are you feeling mentally about it? And would you agree that, it's getting a little bit old at this point?
Yeah, exactly. Well, it is getting old, but at the same time, it's an evergreen situation, meaning that, I've been watching the noon broadcasts or 11 o'clock every day because I'm supporting a client who's launched a COVID-19 symptom tracker. So, if advertising folks are struggling to say, I think selling a snow cone right now feels irrelevant. I have at least that going right now, in that two clients in particular require something that the world requires at this point. And so that's both gratifying, and at the same time it's a little intimidating because the noise floor is enormous.
Yeah, I was talking to someone the other day in an interview, and they talked about clients who don't acknowledge the context of the times we're in as being tone deaf. And I thought
Yeah,
that was a great way of putting it.
it is the perfect way of putting it. It's the way I've seen it, advertising has gone through three phases already. The first phase was when people started to say, "Oh, social distancing. It was a cute thing. It's a good idea." Oh, and so they saw the potential of separating the arches in the McDonald logo, or Audi's rings separating, et cetera, et cetera. And so, in a sense, that set us on the wrong path as an agency, as an industry, because it was about, hey, we can find a fun, creative way to tell you this thing. And while that immediately seemed positive and everything else, instead of thinking longitudinally, it started to make us look like we're here to spin things in a positive way. Whereas in parallel, I think that the pollsters were saying, what is the right tone right now for advertising agencies and their clients if they want to speak to people? And I think the tone that emerged immediately, and hence phase two, was you actually have to show them that you have something useful to contribute to that your brand can somehow be of use to people. And that's when the screw up happened, the second one, which is all those ads that said, we're there for you, we understand how you feel, etc. That was how I view it, is that the agency world decided to go to plan B, which was to to retrieve the kind of Olympic style advertising, meaning we don't have to sell our product right now. We just have to show we care. And so some beautiful stuff was created. One guy playing piano would have gotten every gig because it's all the same piano track. And I would wager that most agencies in the world who created these ads thought they were probably going to be the one that gets noticed, because most agency people don't watch TV. They watch Netflix and everything else. So they didn't see the enormous similarity. And the other thing is, how often does an agency have the experience of having to put out a message that every single person in the world is putting out at the same time? That never happens. Advertising is about being different from everybody, but the pandemic has created one concern, and that's that. So that's phase three. So now phase three. The first one was let's be amusing. The second one is let's show we have heart. And now we're starting to see really actionable stuff. Rethink recommended that Kraft donate their space on TV. Things like that, that's useful. But it was slow getting out of the gate for the industry. We resorted to type.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. And I think this transition between acknowledging the context of where we are and then actually showing value. You mentioned phase three. Well, phase three's got to be the toughest part of this phase. And how do you get past this? How do you get past this idea that you have to extend value to your customers and that there's a cost to it, even though many brands and companies are struggling right now? It's sort of like I could understand a client even looking at you and going, "Hey, Philippe, you're asking me to give away something for free, and I'm already down on one knee here." What have your conversations been like with your clients, and or is there another way of looking at this that I haven't seen yet?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that. What I say to my clients is that, look, there's going to be a report card when this is over. Consumers are going to remember, or journalists or medias or social platforms are going to remind people of the brands that did the right thing and those that didn't. Now, of course, as you point out, if you're hobbled because you're not getting any revenue, and yet you feel that the only responsible thing you can do is to offer, you're a restaurant, you don't have any patrons, but you have to offer them free food now.
Mm-hmm.
You're right. It's a kind of calculus that madness lies within. So you have to do it in a proportional manner into what you do. So the advice is the same to everybody, but the tactics are different. In other words, if you've got the means, if you are an essential service, if you know you're going to be coming back, et cetera, then there's got to be some sort of authentic version of the truth about and how you can propagate a message that doesn't bankrupt your model, but at the same time lets people know that you were there. And lastly, I would say consumers are a lot like people, and right now they're a bit intimidated by the big ask. You're not asked to just do a little thing. You're asked to coalesce as a nation of this or that. And I think that behavioral science has revealed that in some cases you can click on the rejection button because you're just overwhelmed by it all. So in fact, the idea that a brand can't do a grand gesture but only do a little thing may actually be the best thing for them. Diverse, complementary little things that stick in the mind will remind people about you, because one of the tenets we have at our company is that people don't fall in love with your product, they fall in love with your motive for making the product. Well, motives are what matter right now. Why did you do this? You could even make me buy something right now and feel like I'm doing something smart. That's the coup, if you can pull that off.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I think I've seen some examples of even maybe what would be still classified as phase two. At least people supporting local businesses that are around them, which seems to be a little bit more authentic than maybe going to the big charities as it
Yep.
relates to that, which I thought was refreshing and great. So, I mean, you've been doing this or had your place for 24 years, which is unbelievable. I mean, I feel like behind the scenes, I want to ask you, how do you even keep partnership? I mean, most marriages don't last 24 years, let alone, working with people. But 24 years, in those 24 years, you've seen probably a number of economic downturns. And I was going to ask you how this is different. You've already alluded to this in that simultaneously there's something that maybe there's more of a similarity there than other past economic downturns. Um, Tell us a little bit about how you managed previous downturns and how this one is a little bit different, perhaps.
Well, everything from the 2008 mortgage bankruptcy failure. There's a million terms for it, but let's talk about that one because it was the most recent one, and it was a biggie, as you know, subprime mortgages, in other words.
Mm-hmm.
So that comes along, and the good news here for us was that when it came along, we were still leading and stewarding ING Direct. So here was a brand that was in essence a kind of antidote to the profligate spending and everything else. We had a cause, which was savers, and if I use that as an example, we actually thrived during that period because the brand had a natural voice that was going to lend itself to it. So while I don't want to say that we made more money in that way because we were fielding more work, but we felt that the agency at the time, with all of its clients, but in particular the financial one, we were able to find our center even more. So it deepened our conviction. So it didn't change anything. So I have no good advice to give people about how to change their financial model at this time. But if it can make you fall in love with your client even more because you see a relevant association with the times, then something special has happened. The kind of thing that we're observing socially, where people are being put together and it's either making them stronger or it's making money for divorce lawyers. And I don't mean to trivialize what can happen with abuse and such at home, but there is a general consensus that we are being focused on what matters and we're coming together a little bit. Well, that's kind of what happens during financial crises. One of the things we say to our clients when these things happen, and unfortunately we've had to say it a few times now, as you point out, is that this is where the brand can really show what it's made of. Don't look at it as an opportunity, as a problem that says, oh, fewer people are going to buy, their discretionary spending is going down. Look at it in another way and think of it as a chance for you to show, to my point, what your real motives were. And it's okay to have a profit motive. It's simply how honest are you? So we look at it as those moments when everything changes as an opportunity to actually make things more the same, if your version of the same is a good thing. That was a
Yeah,
complicated way of saying it, but you get my point.
yeah, I do, and I think, I think there's that thinking when there's an economic downturn where advertising budgets are the first thing that sometimes clients look at as cutting. They make that old comment about half their dollars, not making a difference. Well, they just don't know which half. Agencies scrambling to maybe in some cases convince clients that they should continue. It makes sense that going dark is probably not the best idea during some time like this. But to your point, differentiating yourself from everybody right now is the most difficult part. It is the phase 3 that you reference, and I know that you are tightly connected to behavioral science as it relates to the work that you do. You were on Hobson's podcast, and you mentioned
Mm-hmm.
it, and I know you had a quote that it was about it being liberating for brands, particularly creatively. So maybe let's touch on that a little bit,
Sure.
because do you have any data? I mean, this is still new days as it relates to this thing. I think everyone agrees that things will be different after this. Do you have data yet? Are you looking at data currently? Are you just trying to figure all that stuff out?
Well, the good news here is that behavioral science has the tools already in place. They're not. The pandemic is still too young for the scientific method to have minted new things. They are probably in the funnel right now because this is one giant behavioral science experiment, essentially, if you look at it that way in terms of,
Yeah.
of tribes and such. However, there are basic heuristics or shortcuts or nudges, which is the more popular term, that become even more important during these times. So yes, behavioral science is still the thing that I turn to the most. And unlike President Trump, I'm going to say right now, I'm not a doctor. I do not have a PhD in behavioral science. I'm just its biggest fan, because when I said on that podcast that I found it liberating, it's because when you think about it as a creative, you say to yourself, that word is daunting. It has to be a creative expression of something. And so when behavioral science gives you evidence-based data that says this is actually going to move somebody more than that, then you can apply your creativity to that versus having a brilliant way of expressing something that behavioral science can tell you that more often than not people will ignore. I'll give you an example. 13 years of writing ads for ING Direct. If I had known in year 2 about what's called loss aversion, which is patently obvious from the term, in that people would rather not lose money than they would prefer to make money. And so think about that in terms of all advertising. Imagine you have a brand like ING Direct at the time, 4.5% interest, and you're saying, tell the world you'll make 4.5% interest. And what a behavioral scientist would have told you is that most people would look at that at the time and say, I probably make something like that. Or, that's not worth it. That's a low number. That's this. Tell them they won't pay a service charge or a fee. Whoosh, interest goes through the roof. I didn't know that. It was just dumb luck that we felt that the fees and the service charges angle, because the research told us this, but it wasn't behavioral science. It was just people said, yeah, I hate paying service charges. So that I'm just using this as a sort of a granular example of if we had known because of behavioral science that we could have applied even more creativity to really stamp that into people's minds. And so think about the opportunities in so many other categories in which you don't look at it as a kind of scientific version of the account executive who tells you it's off strategy. No, that's not the point of behavioral science. It's to equip an agency with the anthropological, scientifically proven data that says it's not that we're predictable, but we are irrationally predictable. And what advertising agencies do and marketers do that's wrong is to believe that the consumer is predictable. You need to find the unpredictable behavior they will have, and that becomes predictable in itself.
Yeah, I think it reminds me of being a young creative, and of course, selling your ideas is a big part of your success. I often say the most creative people I came across, I thought would be the most successful, and it turned out the people who were most successful were the ones who could actually sell, who could convince someone to actually buy, and then
Yeah.
their ideas would come to life. And part of that, of course, is taking as much subjectivity out of it as possible, so that you can look at something and make rational reasons why you should accept that creativity. As it relates to behavioral science, how much interpreting is going on? Because we know that if there could be some interpreting of the data that could send you in the wrong direction. Because I was going to say, is it 100%? You go with an insight that is born out of the data. You're fully convinced that it is correct. You go down that road. It might not work. Has that happened to you in the past?
Sure.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. Behavioral science or behavioral finance, which is a subcategory, or the others, they're all potentially there to be twisted to your purpose. Because, however, if you are going to apply it, it's worth remembering the basics of behavioral science, which is that a behavioral science is a scientific method. Therefore, if it goes out and tests something and it doesn't prove to be true, then they change it. Well, you kind of have to, if you're going to buy into behavioral science, you have to accept that you have to go out and test it and then see at the advertising stage in some cases. So you should have the conviction of it, but you should also be prepared to hack your way to better if you can. Really hard to do with TV, but much easier to do in the world that the world really wants, which is digital. So you can learn and optimize. So the point is you can't cherry pick it, just like, a creative brief where you go, I like that part, and you just take
Hmm.
that, you don't look at the whole. Well, you have to accept that behavioral science is a marker, it's an indication, but what makes the world so marvelous is that human behavior is always dynamic. So
Yeah.
you have to look at it that way. But you're right, there's room for a ton of abuse.
I think also as it relates to the advertising industry, there's a tendency to be romantic about the creative process. I think people look at, I think anyone who works in advertising who looks at television shows like Melrose Place, or even if it's, um, um, something like Mad Men or something, and we romanticize this idea of creativity being something that is not so left-brained. And do you feel that there's some pushback on the data-driven creativity because of that? Because maybe there's a belief that there's some magic in gut instincts, or someone who is wildly creative capturing lightning in a bottle. Have you experienced that at all?
Sure. Um, it's not only have I experienced it, I've been one of those people. When I was at Chiat, for example, we lauded, and rightfully so, the strategic planner, and yet at certain points, because of the culture of Chiat, you were supposed to work with a planner, but you thought you got in because you were brilliant or something. So yes, there is that struggle between the two. But if you really scratch beneath the surface, you find out that a great creative idea is almost always the result of a kind of behavioral science process without the data. Um, I'm not talking about advertising that just gets noticed. I'm talking about advertising that works, that's creative. So I look at it as to be a creative is to be curious, is to be a predator of all sorts of stuff, and you absorb it all. And I think that it makes it more romantic to be a creative if you can be smart as well and say, my ambit is anthropology, behavioral science. The key is my ability to synthesize it on brand and raise the creative level. To have data is not to bleach out creativity, it's to focus it essentially. And so
Hmm.
while it may be frustrating, I remember hearing Peter Gabriel on a documentary talking about, he said, the worst thing you can do to a creative person is give them full license. He said, they'll just flounder. They'll be irresponsible, they'll go everywhere. He said, you give them the smallest little box and they'll try and figure out how to break the code within that box, and it'll be better and different and right. And it may sound like a trite nostrum or something out of a fortune cookie, but it's true. You have to have, because we're not artists, we use applied art to make our point. Um, I think that you can produce, for example, one of the greatest campaigns I think that produced results and stayed in people's minds and has produced endless creativity was for Snickers, when it said, you're not yourself when you're hungry. Ask any mother about her 14-year-old kid being an asshole in the morning because he hasn't had breakfast, or any man basically when he's hungry, et cetera, et cetera. You didn't need to be Margaret Mead to see that. However, think of the years in which people said, tell them what's in it, do this, do that. And suddenly you have this brilliant campaign that goes forever, that rings true. Well, there's no behavioral science in there. There was just great insights and observation. And so to me, if you said, I loved that campaign, I loved how they got to it. Well, the way to make sure that you can run a business versus a once in a while inspiration strikes me, because that's the problem with the romantic vision, is that it implies a muse, it implies serendipity, it implies all sorts of stuff. And if you want to give somebody $1 million a year budget, you want this to be a factory of good stuff. So if you don't have a way to get there, but you just count on inspiration and Starbucks, you have to think about the model a little bit. And then you can burn out, you can do this. It's not that having a process, relying on scientific methods and everything else is going to cramp your style. It's just going to give you legs.
Right. Yeah. I think that's true. That it's liberating more than it is a blue sky, which can be terribly daunting when you don't have anything to cling to. Let alone when you go to try to sell it, and what are you going to say? I like it. Maybe you don't. Um,
Yeah, that's, you need another plan if it's I like it.
yeah.
Well, it's true for me. It must be true for all mankind. No, There are
Yeah.
people who have very different views than you, you know?
Yeah, that's true. It's probably a perfect segue to talk a little bit about your days at Chiat,
Hmm.
which at this point I think it's safe to say we can romanticize as well.
Yeah.
Um, One of the things that I do miss is that as young creatives, you look at the award annuals and you see the splendor of the 60-second commercial and the traditional media and the simplicity of an outdoor board that sums up everything in 4 words or less, and and now you have this digital media that is fragmenting media, where ideas um, can be a lot more complicated in a way. Um, and I kind of miss the days of opening up an annual and seeing like um, the Canadian Airlines ads, um, and and being able to experience them in real time out in my world, and then seeing them celebrated in the annuals. Well, now it seems as though I see some great ideas and brilliant ideas that I think are fabulous, but I've never seen them before in my life. Um, and at first, I thought it was because I'm like everybody else. I don't tend to listen to AM/FM radio, or my watching, my viewing is all appointment based, and it's Netflix or something else. Um, but I think it's safe to say that we don't see it out there. And um, do you miss those days too? And it legitimized to me. It also legitimized everything. I could point at it and say, I remember seeing that, and it was very creative, and I'm sure it worked too.
Right. Do I miss those days? Who wouldn't miss certainty or feeling? How shall I put it? That you're always right and this and that. The advertising world as we knew it in the days of Chiat and before that DDB was at a period where brands could be taught. Now they have to be observed. We don't all gather around the same fireplace at night the way we did around Ed Sullivan. For those who won't know what that is, but anyways,
Yeah.
appointment television is gone. We Do I miss an era in which the only ad you could see walking on the street was a billboard, not something on your phone, and so on and so forth? No, I don't miss them, and I'll get back to that in a moment. But I do miss the simplicity of the period. But I believe that digital advertising, which is a word that I still sticks in my mouth because I think, why do I have to say the word digital? It's advertising now, because we have to
Hmm.
be where the consumer is. Do I want to wait till sunrise to get a shot that'll look good on a phone? No. I'd like it to look good on a 64-inch screen with HD and 4K. And that still exists in the rarefied air of sports and a few other things. But I think that what you and I struggle with, people with gray hair in our beards, or hair if we had any on our head, is the fact that we got into advertising because we liked the good stuff we were seeing, and we thought there was a connection with making great work and making clients and commerce move along. But notice that the last part, the making the client successful and improving commerce, that wasn't really foremost in our minds, young creatives who wanted to get in after and wanted to work for Lee Clow or work for Bill Bernbach if you were a different generation. I shouldn't say this and speak for everybody, but the point was to win an award, was to grow your career. And if the account person said, by the way, you sold a lot more product, you went, oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
It's a bit, so that led to a lot of really bad stuff in our industry. And the clients started to notice that we had higher regard for the ads they didn't buy, which we entered in award shows, and so on and so forth. So that's why when we created our agency, the first thing we did was say we will enter no award shows. And that wasn't a declaration, as some thought, that, oh, you want to do this dull work? No, we want to have the ability to say to our client, I want you to buy this edgy idea because it's the right idea, not because it'll win us an award. Same thing, we didn't mark up anything. So that if we recommended a $500,000 or a $750,000 TV production, they knew we weren't trying to get the 15% markup on it. You had to aggregate a number of the pathologies, if you will, of advertising agencies that were in aggregate leading to the client saying, wow, there's TV shows now about ads. There's award shows. There's America's Funniest, the television commercials, et cetera, et cetera. None of this is about us. It's about the agencies and things like that. So something needed to change. So while I miss the old days, I would not like to be at the helm of an old style agency that counts on those things. And then lastly, when you're coming up with ideas and you say to yourself, I've got like more than I know what to do with. Well, that's kind of how I viewed the digital revolution. When I thought, this is the headline for the newspaper ad, but I've got about 7 other ideas. I can try that out in digital. And in fact, that was just me transitioning from a period in which I thought everybody's going to look at that one page, which of course they weren't. You just have to turn the page and it's gone. And the digital ads started to excite me more because you could be more daring, you could be more experimental, you could do all sorts of stuff. And if it didn't work, you pull it.
So we're seeing a lot of internal agencies popping up more again. And I know that the ad industry has seen this phenomenon happen more than once, and I'm sure you've lived through it too. Where you might see personnel from big agencies that are plucked to create internal agencies. Most notably, maybe of late, is the banks, and I know you work in that sector a lot. What do you make of this? It seems it's something that comes into fashion and then goes away again. And what's your position on all this as it relates to getting the best work? Because I think a lot of creatives look at it and sort of think, do I really want to work on the same thing over and over, even though with digital media and the fragmentation of media, there are more and more ways to express your creativity than ever before. But what's your position on that, and what do you think about it?
Well, it's interesting because it's not just happened to our industry; it's happening to other industries. Law firms, for example. Did you ever consider or anticipate the day when a company would simply hire their own lawyer and they would be on staff instead of having access to legal firms? Well, that's happening left, right, and center. And the lawyer who gets hired can make a lot of money staying inside and not have to deal with any of the other problems. So let's set that aside, but simply take away from it that tried and very hidebound industries are experiencing this right now. So when you look at the concept of a bank, for example, having its own marketers in-house, there really is no reason why it couldn't be exactly like an agency. You could still put people through if they get tired, et cetera, et cetera. The question is just staff it properly. So there's a certain economic decision that has to be made, and one of the things that I suspect an internal agency wouldn't want to do is to have the superstar model where, you could say, if it's not my way, I go to the next agency, I have so many awards, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to cause, as this phenomena grows, as you say, it's come and gone. I mean, Lintas was Lever Internal Advertising. I forget, it's an acronym, but it was an agency. So what's happening is I'm seeing 2 things happening. I'm seeing clients, let's say, that are medium sized, not a big bank, saying to themselves, if I hire somebody internally to do this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I don't have to pay those big agency fees. But they do really bad math, those people, because what they say, if you said to an agency, or an agency to client, I'm going to charge you $100,000 as a retainer for the year. They say, oh, that's too much. I can hire like 2 people for $50,000. Yeah. And here's what happens. You get those 2 people for $50,000 and you get $50,000 worth of experience a year, which is not, as we know, very great. Mm-hmm. And then because you can't keep 2 people like that busy 24 hours, 40 hours a week, you're paying approximately the same as you would have paid the agency, where you would have had a team of people that, and we handle that part, in other words, fresh ideas, experience, etc. And instead you find those 2 people, and then organizations being what they are, those 2 people eventually make a case for you hiring a 3rd person they can be above. The next thing you know, the client finds themselves with about $250,000 in hard costs a year, so that they could avoid paying an agency $100,000 for a vastly better product that doesn't suffer from the mirror in front of you problem. So that's what's happening with the small ones. But the big ones, and it's impacting our business dramatically because we're
Hmm.
finding clients are saying, I'm just going to hire somebody else and internally and do it ourselves. I've experienced this many times, and I've given this story, this not lecture, but this approach, or this point of view to the client when they came back. And they said, you're
Yeah.
right. I don't know what we were thinking. And it's possibly because venture capitalists say, I don't want you spending money on agencies. You can do it all with a viral ad. You can do it all with free PR. You can do it all. And they probably know better, but they go, yeah, but it's their money. They're investing, so I should listen. So anyways, well, let's not get too much into that. But if you're the Royal Bank of Canada, you can actually hire, I mean, theoretically, you could have hired me and said, what do I know about bank advertising? Well, 13 years of ING Direct, Bank of Nova Scotia, Bank of Montreal, et cetera. I think I could produce a pretty good agency for you if you cross my palms with silver, and I'll keep it rotating, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what will they save? They'll save a whole bunch. It'll, all sorts of things can happen. What should they worry about? Getting stale, getting complacent, all the things that an advertising agency is supposed to fight. However, if we're really critical about ourselves, we get stale and complacent because every time a new idea has to be generated, that's more time and effort that might not result in something. So it brings you back to this big one point, which is if your brand has the fundamentals and the right strategy, then coming up with new and fresh stuff doesn't mean the new strategy. It just means new creative on the existing strategy. So there are ways to solve for that problem. But I think just like the fact that Zulu, for example, has its own editing facilities, its own sound, et cetera, and people are going, that's crazy. The other industries are going to be sorry. They just went and hired those people. Why
Right.
would they do that? It makes no sense. The advertising industry is a child. It was only created at the beginning of the 1900s. We haven't figured out the ultimate model, and we're just clinging to the raft. And by saying, no, it has to be an agency with an atrium, with a basketball hoop, with a foosball table. Creatives have to have beards and do drugs and all that. That whole model is nostalgia.
Yeah, well, on the heels of that, I mean, you raised the point. A, what about the freshness of ideas? B, we have preconceived notions on where the best creativity comes from, and even what it looks like. And here we are. We did a podcast recently with Gary Watson. He brought up the often dangerous territory of ageism in
Yep.
advertising. I loved your comment about advertising still being in its infancy and we're immature. And one of those, and it's maybe not because I have a little bit of gray hair or less hair, is that with most other industries, you see more experience equates to more value. I know you're operating on a much different level. You're a company owner. You're a very I think company owners have more longevity as it relates to that. But what of the very senior writers and art directors that are out there that are experiencing a little bit of this? Well, you're getting a little bit long in the tooth to be hanging out with the young guys in the creative department.
Yeah, I have seen that, of course. You can only so much sing "I'm Young at Heart" so much. I think that if rationalism prevails, somebody would look at you and say, "Are you the right person to be doing an ad for a skateboard brand?" This. I'm purposefully being theatrical and isolating the target market as something that evokes thoughts that you'd want to make sure you spoke the vernacular, that you understood the culture, et cetera, et cetera. That becomes then an object lesson for, are you saying that I can only advertise to for product that I relate to personally? Because
Mm-hmm.
that would be extremely confining. That being said, you can win the argument but lose the war on that one because people still want to judge according to certain things. I would create a taxonomy in my mind of the person coming in to argue the strategy can do just fine with silver hair. The person presenting the creative would look better if two things happened: if they were probably middle-aged and above all female, because that's another problem in our industry. It's not just ageism; it's gender diversity, it's racial diversity, it's all sorts of things like that that have to be improved. So ageism is just the first target, and so I had an agency president once say to me something that I thought was really interesting. he said that when he sits in a meeting, and even if the clients on the other side of the table are young, he said if he's in there and he has his young creative director and a young team, he said everybody looks at the silver-haired guy. And he said, so my job is to get out of that room as soon as possible, because it's just an instinctive reaction to age and stature that we have. And you throw in height and a whole bunch of other things. I'm talking now, I guess, back to behavioral science. So we, and I'm making this point to say we crave hearing from people who have the confidence of their views and because they've seen the situation before, and we cherish novelty. And it's blending those two together that is so important. So ageism's not going to go away, but it is, because of the remoteness that we're doing now, et cetera, I'm finding, at least even in the last month or so, that something called the Zoom effect is kicking in. And what I'm hearing is that management teams, for example, are working together now on video without the pageantry of a corner office, the seat the boss always takes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When a cat walks across the keyboard and the CEO is there in a sweatshirt and he only has, or she only has, the same 1 inch by 2 inch screen, there's a kind of egalitarianism that is seeping in. And I'm thinking that people might be working better that way because there aren't the trappings of hierarchy, or at least they're not as obvious. They exist, of course. The boss is the boss, but the working style doesn't have the decor of authority versus juniorness. Not a word, but you get my point. Mm-hmm. And so I think that a number of other factors are going to come into the mix. If ageism exists, digital distancing will remove certain things because there will be other clues, other cues. You won't see them like say, "Oh, my back," when they get up, or any of those things. So it's a fluid world right now, and if you read Gladwell, and what would you judge if there was a screen and the person auditioned behind it, and you find out the case he cites of the Berlin Philharmonic trying to audition a French horn player, and it was a small Japanese woman who played the best, and they were saying, yeah, but to this Teutonic race, they just couldn't wrap their head around that. Mm-hmm. But if you put up a blind, shall we say, and you only listen to the sound, they ended up picking the best player. So I think that what we need is a kind of a blind now, so that ageism is not considered, doesn't rear its ugly head. And I think you're right. I think that other industries recognize that the more you do something, the more you should be getting better at it. I loved hearing Phil Collins once say, "I'm an extraordinary drummer." And the reporter said, "Well, that's pretty." And he said, "I've been playing since I'm 6. I'm 56. You play for 50 years. You'll be good at it too." Yeah. And I think that that's true. And then there's all sorts of other pathologies that creep in, being narrow-minded, saying all the things that they call, the sort of seizing up of the brain as you get older. Well, a lot of that is bullshit, and some of it is true. But advertising is meant to keep you on your toes and be aware of your marketplace. That's your job. So I would be happy to take on an ageist argument.
Well, I think it's a perfect segue into talking a little bit, just quickly, on what we can take away from this experience that we're in right now, because there seems to be plenty of silver lining, particularly in the way in which we work. I know that there are some holdouts out there as it relates to working virtually and whether or not it can work or not. And here we are, forced into our homes for the last, week 7 or whatever we're in now. And our experience at our place has been that it's worked actually quite well. Now, the question still remains that once we reopen and we get back at it, what are we going to take with us? Are we going to apply it? And what will that look like? You're a business owner. Where are you on that?
Well, here's where I am. I had a lease 10 years ago. That was approximately $250,000 a year. Just to have the space that we had. Then I rethought the model, got it down to 10, and now I'm down to 1, and I have no lease, $1,000 a month for the office space, because it's used as a rotating area that we go into for meetings and boardroom calls, and the CFO is there and such, but everything else has been distributed for a while now. Why? Because I had a firsthand experience doing it for 5 years when I led an agency that we created on the side called I2, Ideas and Issues, that was devoted exclusively to producing advertising that was targeting policymakers, regulators, governments on behalf of associations. So a very niche market with a very real communication requirement. And we did that using strategists and people from across Canada. So we never bothered to create an office. We worked virtually. So I got to do that and then saw what happened. And a lot of chair of sacred cows fell by the wayside. You know, the thought that you could sit there as a creative director myself and sit behind the art directors and look at the work and play with it, et cetera, et cetera. There's a ton of technical proxies for that. And so that's not an issue. Communication, you've got to be prepared to accept that you might call the same person 7 times in 7 minutes because that's what you would have done if you'd walked over. And then eventually you figure out how to do that right. So with very minor accommodation, I think that a lot of agency owners are going to look at this and say, wow, why do I have to spend all that when the people, certain members of our team, were more comfortable? It depends on your situation. If you've got 2 toddlers in the house, et cetera, and your apartment, you're living on top of each other, because who says you have to own a home to be, no, you could have been a young creative. So my point is, you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. But if somebody says, I'm digging this, I think you can work a little harder and still create a potent agency culture and survive this. I think that it's because we did it that way doesn't mean we have to continue doing it that way. Nor does it mean that because remote work, it's the best thing. It won't be for everybody, but it certainly works for me as a writer.
Yeah, I mean, I think I always ask every guest that's on about what advice they can give someone who wants to emulate what you've done. I think it's self-evident that you have stayed on top of things clearly out of a passion for wanting to do that. You've had a long career. And so I guess I'll ask a 2-part question. One is, I think everybody is looking to have complete control or as much control over their career as possible. And as it relates to longevity, so what advice would you give to a young creative who wanted to have a long career in this business? And then I guess secondly, maybe the 2-part is, what are you doing right now? Because it doesn't seem as though you're slowing down anytime soon.
Okay. So first question is, if you're a young creative and you want to have a long career, I think the first question I would ask, so I have a son in the industry and we had this conversation and I said, you have to absolutely follow the fire in your gut. You've got to, if making creative is cracking that big idea, if doing all that is the reason you're in it, then develop that muscle as much as you can. But try developing another one and link the two, which is give a shit about what your work does in the marketplace. Care about the client. Don't isolate yourself or silo yourself, because as your ideas get better, you're going to get ideas that you're going to want to see through, because you're going to start to receive different feedback loops. An award is a feedback loop, but the marketplace can be an extraordinarily potent feedback loop. Regard for you, growing respect, and that's only going to happen if they don't see you as somebody that is brought in once in a while, and when there's a creative meeting. So involve yourself in the business, but never forget what your expertise is, but keep adding to it, because it's not about doing someone else's job, it's about understanding their job better so that you can better. If it's just about elocution, etc., versus it's about the work and what it made happen, then you will have a very brilliant and long career. Also, because, and this is my personal bias, we call ourselves brand engineers on purpose, is that a brand can only be proven over the dimension of time. An ad is not a brand. The same message, promise, and tone and voice and character over a year, 2, 3, 4, that's how you know you've created something lasting, a full personality for your brand. So the idea that you're only in it and you go, oh, I won an award on that one, now I want to move to the next thing. At a certain point, you're going to have an idea so big, so good, so fundamental, you're going to want to raise it. You're going to want to stick with it, and you won't get bored. Believe me, I spent 13 years writing everything for ING Direct, and I never got bored. Because every time I was solving a different problem, but I knew which paintbrushes I was going to go to. And then as the industry changed and as the world changed, we had access to all the digital tools, etc. It didn't get boring, and I was terrified it would. And so was my partner when we founded it. Bruce Phelps, a brilliant genius of a guy, said, can I legitimately partner with two creatives who will not say to me, I'm bored? Because the whole premise of the company was going to be, we have to do this longitudinally. And so I kind of said, oh, absolutely. And I didn't know if I meant it. Then I found out I did.
Amazing. Okay, part two of that question is, what are you
Right.
doing? What are you doing now? And what are you
Okay.
excited about?
So right now I'm excited. I want to save the world. Now, working with a quasi pro bono client who happens to have spent the last 10 years creating these extraordinary patient self-assessment tracking apps. So, for example, you have a heart condition, and a big hospital network in the United States wants to do some research. If you have a heart condition, you download the app, you track your symptoms every day, and it dramatically amplifies the data they have to work with to produce new drugs, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what this company did for 10 years. Along comes COVID-19, and they realized they have this expertise creating apps that understand patient behavior, and they could create one for COVID-19. So that's what they did. Then they partnered with the Roche Coalition for Data Science, which is a not-for-profit coalition that launched 2 weeks ago. And the whole purpose of it is to make all the data, try and get as much data out of citizens and people, bring it to one place, then organize it and feed it back. So, because the thing that we're facing right now is we don't know enough. We don't know enough the difference, between a Black African person's reaction to it, to an Asian person, to a Scandinavian, etc. We need all this data. Cut to the chase. I'm trying to figure out how to get millions of Canadians to download this free app and become data donors. And the company that created this was never intended to be a public-facing company. So their business model does not have in it a budget to get the message out. So that's what I'm doing today and every day now, is trying to figure out how to get Canadians to simply go to this website, download the app, and protect themselves, but at the same time become a data donor. So that's occupying a lot of my thoughts right now, and resourcefulness and so on and so forth, because it's a real product with a real benefit for everybody, and it's got a clean social conscience. It's a betterness product, everything else. You'd think it would be easy, but it's challenging. It's also exhilarating. And separately, I'm doing another project with a fintech brand that is focused on salvaging the wealth management industry, your financial advisors and such. Who hasn't phoned them and then heard the famous words, well, I'd sit tight,
Right.
and that's about it. So the industry is in dire need of some changes. So I'm supporting and brand engineering a brand that essentially will allow those people to go fully digital. As surprising as that sounds in 2020, the wealth management industry, because of compliance and a whole bunch of other things, have a lot of paper stuff, a lot of this, about it's kind of like Frankenstein, that software. This is a fully integrated system that will allow people to do things, including behavioral science, so they can understand the customer better and things like that. So I'm excited on one hand to try and help an industry that could be becoming less and less relevant survive, and another one to help sort of people just survive, literally. So those two things, and then the other brands that we support, Explore Mobile, which is a mobility brand in Saskatchewan. So we have some retail activity going on there, even though people can't go to the store, stuff like that. So it's very interesting. And the last project, which I'm hoping to start next week, is in the biofuel industry, America's largest refiner of bio and renewable diesel. Because as you know, the only cars on the road right now are fleets and trucks. and this company makes a low carbon fuel. So it sounds like, if I was listening to myself, that I'm in the altruistic business, low carbon, better health, this and that. But these are things that matter, and they don't. They're not expressed through just a creative campaign. It needs some heavy thinking, and that's always more challenging and fun.
Well, we could anyone listening or watching, we've learned a lot on this podcast. I think your advice still stands the test of time, and it's been great sitting down and talking to you. It's been great to see you. It's been so long, and it's great to talk to you and reconnect with you.
Thank you.
I thank you very much for your time today and sharing your thoughts on the business and where we're headed and what we're currently living with. So thanks so much, Philippe.
You're so welcome, and thank you for asking me. I was immediately attracted to the theme, and I hope there's something in there that some listeners can take away, and I think even sharing my thoughts has given me something to take away as well. So that's a win-win. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Philippe.
This episode has been brought to you by the National Advertising Challenge, North America's only brief-based challenge that sends winners to Cannes, France.